I'm going to introduce the panelists by reading their bios. We have our John Roscoe. John Roscoe is a partner with the law firm of Holden, Roscoe in Cadenton, practicing in real estate, probate, and estate planning. John earned his law degree from the University of Florida in December of 1998. He currently serves as General Counsel for the Gainesville Area Chamber of Commerce, the Gainesville-Alachua County Association of Realtors, the Builders Association of North Central Florida, and he is on the advisory board for Sun State Bank. Coming from the Orlando area, we have Kelly Cutchin. Kelly, in 2006, Kelly joined the Money Corp team based out of their Orlando, Florida office. Kelly has served as chairman of the Global Real Estate Council of Orlando and continues to sit on their global committee as well as several other global committees at various real estate organizations throughout the state. Her presentations about global business and the foreign exchange industry stretch from California to New York and from the USA to Canada and the UK. We also have with us today Maury Ivy. Maury Ivy was born in Gainesville, Florida in 1981. He received his BA from University of Florida, bachelor's from the University of Florida in 2013, and his JD from the University of Florida in 2018. Maury began his legal practice in the areas of real estate, estate planning, and probate, though now he focuses exclusively on real estate transactions. Maury is married to Abby, has 2 young daughters, and enjoys the ocean, reading, and traveling in Latin America. Please give them a hand. We're very happy to have them. Thank you for joining us today. And like I said, on the bottom, there's a QR code for an evaluation at the end. All right, with that, we're going to get started by having the panelists tell us a little bit more about themselves and their organizations. And John, if we could start with you.
Sure. I know many of these faces out here, some I don't know. I am a practicing real estate attorney. I do high volume residential and also commercial closings. We also do some estate planning and probate work at our office. And I've been practicing what will be coming up on 20 years this year at the current firm, so rolling into the 20th year.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you.
Do you need me to use the microphone?
No, can you hear Kelly in the back?
Okay. Well,
Could you hear me? Go ahead.
are we good? Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Cutchin. I'm currently the country manager for Money Corp here in North America. If you're not familiar with Money Corp, we do specialize in currency exchange and international transfers. And you might be asking yourself, well, why would someone utilize a company like Money Corp versus just doing a transfer through their traditional bank? And there are quite a few reasons, but a few of those would be, number one, we offer highly competitive rates of exchange. When you're working with a foreign national buyer, it's really important that they shop around to get the best rate of exchange available. Effectively, we can give them more bang for their buck, meaning that you can sell them a more expensive property. We'll say it like that. But the second thing to consider is that exchange rates fluctuate constantly, right? Does anyone remember when the British pound to the US dollar was 2-to-1?
Yes.
Or when the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar was 1-to-1? So we all know exchange rates fluctuate constantly. Money Corp does have the ability to lock into an exchange rate for up to 2 years. So if you're working with a foreign national buyer now that's not going to be able to close on their property till the end of the year, the start of the new year, it's important for them to consider locking into that rate so that we can remove that risk of it fluctuating against them and them ultimately having to back out of that transaction altogether. So that's just something that you want to consider when you are working with a foreign national buyer. If you're working with a foreign national seller, we want to help make sure that those sellers don't get their funds stuck here in the US. So there's something known as the United States Patriot Act. And unfortunately, if you're dealing with a foreign national seller and the title company is going to get to a point where they say, well, what do you want us to do with your proceeds? And if the customer, not knowing any better, tells the title company, just put my money in my US bank account, I'll worry about it next week. Unfortunately, when they call the bank next week, they're probably gonna tell them, we can't do an international wire transfer without you being physically present in your branch. And that's obviously gonna expose them to some pretty unfortunate decisions, which would involve them getting on a flight, flying over, visiting the branch, signing a piece of paper, and getting their money that's rightfully theirs. So we just want to make sure that we're a resource for you so that you are aware of all these weird things that can happen so that your transactions run smoothly. So again, I'm really grateful that I'm here today. So I'm seeing some familiar faces. So I am based in Orlando. If any of you will be at the Florida Realtor Conference, make sure that you visit and say hi. But again, thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Kelly.
My name is Mari Ivy. I'm an associate attorney at Scruggs, Carmichael, and Wershow, which is a pretty large firm and covers a lot of areas. My little department began doing real estate, probate, estate planning, and some other real property related things with the court, foreclosures, quiet title actions. But over the past couple of years, I've pretty much just focused on overseeing lots of residential real estate closings because the past couple of years really required that, and it just got really busy. So I slowly moved that other stuff off, and I like it. So that's pretty much all I'm doing right now. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Maureen. I pronounced that right this time.
Yeah, my parents say Mari. Most people call me Maury. I Googled it once and Google says it's Maury. Either one works for me.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. All right, so let's start the conversation by asking like the most basic question. You know, what is fraud in real estate? And so John, from an attorney's perspective, what is fraud?
So I think we need to bifurcate it into two different types of fraud, okay? Both of which I think can be discussed. The first type of fraud is the good old-fashioned wire type fraud, okay? And in that example of wire fraud, Maury and I are the targets. You all are the facilitators, okay? So in that facilitation, what the fraudster is trying to get at is our trust account, where the money is housed, okay? So what the fraudster will do is say, hey, John, thanks so much for a great closing yesterday. Hey, listen, seller wants to change their wire instructions to move their proceeds into their Ameritrade account or something along those lines. Please see below for the revised instructions, okay? That's your classic fraud that we have been trying to eliminate in our area. So what is the relationship that you all have with our office when it comes to wire instructions? My answer is the only thing that you need to do is to facilitate to your customer who the closing paralegal is at our office or Maury's office or wherever it is, the contact information with phone number and email so that we then can build that direct relationship with the client, okay? So that when they're at closing, we have them fill out the wire instruction paperwork with me in the room. And I tell them, if you try to change this, we're going to call the FBI. Or alternatively, I would need you to meet the paralegal that you know that you're going to change this because you didn't bring all the information. So I want you all to meet each other, to see each other, to hear each other's voices and exchange phone numbers so that really you've done your job by simply facilitating, introducing your customer to us so that we can defeat the wire fraud by not allowing another party being in the middle of that. Okay? So that's on the wire part. There's another part that we can talk about, but you may want to run that down the line for a minute.
So Kelly, on the wire fraud aspect of it, what are you seeing from a Money Corp perspective?
Same types of things, right? We often see people receive an email from what they think is the title company saying, instead of wiring your funds to this account at XYZ title company, we need you to wire it to this account instead, right? And that's kind of an email takeover fraud that I think at this point everyone sees a lot of. And unfortunately, there's just clients that don't take the necessary precautions to verify those wiring instructions. They take that email as gospel. They tell their bank to wire the money to this other account, and unfortunately, we all know where that story ends. So we do see attempts like that. I think the number one thing that's different, what we've heard is there's not always the opportunity to meet with your buyer or seller in person when you're working with a foreign national client, right? So this is where we just need to be hypersensitive to the potential of fraud, and at the end of the day, it's just extremely important that before anybody ever pushes confirm, send, whatever that command is, that they pick up the phone and they're verbally confirming those wiring instructions, right? Because if we're dealing with a foreign national seller and the buyer, and the title company has sent different instructions to this buyer than what they originally were going to transfer funds to, all that it would take is them picking up the phone, talking to the paralegal or the title company directly to say, hey, you know, I received those new wiring instructions. Before I push send, I just wanted to verify those details. And immediately they're gonna say, we didn't change those wiring instructions, pump the brakes, let's make sure that we verify everything. So I think, you know, in this day and age, everyone is so in tune with sending a text message and an email before we pick up the phone, right? Like so many people's voicemails are full now, right? Because we just don't use our phones to actually have conversations so often. But when it comes to transferring money, let's just get back to basics and pick up the phone and verbally confirm all wiring instructions before anybody ever sends funds anywhere. This happens, I mean, my grandparents have been targeted for things like this, unrelated to real estate, right? It happens all the time. So again, don't be afraid of saying, let me slow down, let me stop here, let me call you back, and do all those things that you think are just elementary, or maybe I don't need to do that. Just take the time to do them, even if you feel 99.9% sure that it's fine. Just go through those exercises that we've all learned over the years to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's.
Thank you, thank you. Maureen, you know, from a title perspective, we're used to the title work starting earlier in the transaction than, say, with the final disbursement of funds. So you're probably, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe going to see some fraud prior to it gets to this level, to it gets to this point in the transaction. Can you tell us what you're seeing?
Yeah, so if we're talking about the same type of wire fraud, there's a few big movements of money in a transaction. The buyer's got to get their money to the closing company, usually 2 transactions, a binder deposit, which is smaller, and then the much bigger cash to close. Then the closing company has to get a big amount of money to a seller, and in many cases also to a payoff lender, though you can send a check to them. For that matter, you could send a check to anybody, and for a long time we tried to hold on to sending checks to people, but it's 2023 and people are demanding wires. Banks are trying to demand, like payoff lenders are demanding wires, and there's a lot of good to be said about wires. They're quick, they're easy, it's instant funds. It's not like a personal check, it's actually collected funds that a closing company can disperse on. But for that same reason, they're very vulnerable. Just like John and Kelly were saying, if I'm a criminal, all I have to do is monitor emails, figure out that a transaction's happening through some type of email spoofing, phishing, fake email account that looks normal. I insert myself into the transaction and I tell the buyer, hey, it's Mari from the closing company, use these wired instructions instead. Buyer follows them, boom, $150,000 is gone, it's instant, it's in another country, it's not coming back. They do the same thing to us. Hey, I'm seller so-and-so, you know, we've been speaking this whole time. Here's my wire instructions. Don't send me a check. I prefer a wire. It's a lot easier. I fall for that. I send it to them, and it's gone. The second one, at least I have control over. And just like John was saying, and Kelly was saying, we don't know these people. We don't always see them. You know, there's remote closings. We'll reach out to realtors and say, hey, have you guys met this person? Oh yeah, we went to high school together. Great. Then is this the phone number? Yeah, that's their phone number. Okay, let's just three-way, let's get them on the phone. I'll get their wire and instructions, no problem. We have something to go off of. I know this is not a criminal. You can just slowly step away from that scenario where you can end up where, no, I don't know them. No, I've never seen them. They contacted me through Zillow. In fact, nobody's ever seen them. Okay, where do we get the closing documents notarized? Through some, you know, who knows, in another part of the country. So it starts to look suspicious. You can't verify this person. You know, there's no central database with pictures and all this type of stuff to verify people. There are tools, but so that's really on that wire fraud what we see is people looking to intercept those amounts of money with their own fraudulent wiring instructions. And of course, the hardest one there is the buyers, because all you all can do and all we can do, and everybody does it, you see it on everybody's email, never trust wiring instructions, you educate buyers, but at the end of the day, you know, people are trusting. If the fraudster's email looks good, you know, you may educate the heck out of a buyer and they just still fall for it and send the money. So it's tough, you know, it's tough. You gotta call. Basically, I feel like a detective sometimes. You know, I gotta start Facebook, Google, public records, call people, feel them out, spring a question on them. If it's really suspicious, I'll say, hey, I got a form that needs to be notarized and we need to do remote online notarization. These types of things scare fraudsters away. They don't really want to be videotaped. They don't want to come into the office. They don't want to see you or talk to you, you know. Although I have had a fraudster who actually talked on the phone. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Okay, so in addition to the money part, we've got other types of fraud. John, what would be another model, another type of?
So the hot topic right now is the vacant land fraudulent program, okay? The instructions from our title insurance underwriters are, as of right now, if you have a vacant land transaction, treat it as if it is a fraud unless you have personal knowledge of the people in the transaction. That's a very high standard, okay? So I want to give you the observation, but I also want to give you some strategic choices to help mitigate this problem, okay? So your most basic form of land, vacant land fraud, or for that matter, improved land, it doesn't matter, is for someone to forge a deed, record it on the public records, either as a sale to a third party or just to vest title in themselves, and then go and look for a cash out refinance of some sort, okay? So your first start with analyzing whether you're in that type of transaction is, how long has the deed been of record? Is there a mortgage lender encumbering the property? Do the sellers live out of state or in state? And what relationship, if any, do we have with these folks, okay? So if you start getting suspicious, like, gosh, this deed has been of record since 1965, but when I call the guy and he never answers, and he only calls me on WhatsApp, and he sounds like he's 20, maybe you got a problem. Because in 1965, that person wasn't alive, okay? So these kind of common sense things are ways to combat that. Another way to combat that is if you're being called upon to list a property and you're suspicious, or you just want to have good practices, send the letter that says, I've been requested to list your property to the address shown on the tax bill. And I know of at least one instance where that letter was sent and they got a call from a hysterical lady that said, I did not authorize you to list my property for sale at all. It's not for sale, okay? So those are all strategies, okay? Another strategy is to sign up for Property Watch. That's a service provided by the Alachua County Property Appraiser's Office. It's easy. I did it a couple weeks ago, okay? What they will do is they will notify you if someone records a deed or a mortgage affecting the title to your property. Now, it's not an insurance policy. You still have to unwind the transaction, but nonetheless, you now have a contemporaneous notice that someone is trying to mess with my title. And there's been some great sensationalized news stories on that, and everybody feels the victim and all that, but no one ever talks about the remedy, okay? So let's do that for just a moment. So the remedy is if someone records a fraudulent deed on the public records purporting to affect your title, you file a lawsuit for declaratory relief to declare that the document that was recorded on the public records is a forgery and is therefore, here's your Latin word of the day, void ab initio. It's void from the beginning. It does not serve to pass title. It merely clouds the title. So you have a hearing with the judge. You say, Your Honor, that's not my signature on that document right there. And then who's there to provide counter evidence? Nobody. Because it's a fraud. So they don't want to appear in court and try to defend the title. So the court signs and says, I find that this deed is a fraud and is of no force or effect, and I set it aside. Okay? Well, that's all fine if you don't have a third party that hasn't tried to purchase that property, or a lender that hasn't loaned money in reliance on the status of title. Okay? So you as the owner, you're good. You just set aside the deed and the mortgage. What happens to our lender and to our buyer? Well, they better hope they got a good title insurance policy, because otherwise they're going to be out of luck. Okay? But that's the completed thought you don't get on, some news coverage kind of thing. That's the ultimate remedy.
Kelly, from an international standpoint, because Money Court deals with lots of international transactions. I would imagine you're not involved with fees, but what are some of the ABCs, some of those things that we should look out for as real estate professionals?
So one thing I'll say is there's few industries out there that are as regulatory as or under as much compliance scrutiny as a foreign currency exchange or money service business, right? We've got to abide by anti-money laundering regulations, criminal activity list. We need to make sure that we're not working with politically exposed people or customers that appear on sanctions lists. So if you're working with a client that has transacted through Money Corp, it should take some weight off of your shoulders in knowing that you're working with someone that has been verified and is doing legal activity. So I can't really speak to this specific instance, but I can just speak to some of those ABCs, right? Over the course of my 17 years with Money Corp, I cannot tell you the amount of realtors that have called me and said that they're working with a customer named Dr. Brown out of the UK that has $25 million to purchase a property in Gainesville. Does this sound familiar? Has anyone ever had an email that just sounds too good to be true? It is too good to be true. Feel free to send me that email. I'll take one look at it and I'll say, oh, here's 25 other emails that were exactly the same from exactly the same email address that matches the portfolio of this or the traits of this client that is emailing you. So if you receive something and you think it's too good to be true, but you just want somebody to confirm that you don't need to waste your time with it, feel free to send it over to us. We will have our compliance team take a quick look at it, and we're happy to tell you, don't waste your time on this. Should we take questions now?
Got any questions before we move on?
On that particular note, I had a question, or do you want me to wait?
Please.
In regards to that, I have received something so very similar. And what about proof of funds? Are you able to verify those for us?
Yes, if you want to send me a proof of funds document, sometimes I'm able to look at it, and again, just through my experience, I can tell you a couple of things that stand out that look like a fraudulent document,
Okay.
right? Things like typos. If you see consistent typos in an email, it's probably not legit. If you hover over certain links and it doesn't take you to the website that you think that it's coming from, it's probably a fraudulent document. But absolutely, if you have a document and you just want someone to confirm its legitimacy, then by all means forward it over to me. I'll look at it or escalate it to our compliance team that has a whole slew of additional resources to verify a document, and then we're happy to pass that feedback back to you. Yeah, always do that. So those are just, you know, a few
Just
things.
second, we have another question.
I have a twofold question. One was, as Mr. John Roscoe mentioned, that when the transaction happens, and if there is a lender involved in it and the transaction is already transpired, hope that they have a good title insurance. So what should we look out for, or the owner or the buyer or the seller look out for in the title insurance that would cover this aspect of the fraudulence in some way, or protect them against this? Because we wouldn't even know what to look out for that in that.
Well, the first stop is just to make sure that you have title insurance, period, okay? Because a fraudster is going to try to get to do anything but have title insurance in the transaction or have professionals looking at the transaction. So their proposal is going to be some side deal, or, you know, oh, we don't need lawyers for this, we don't need title insurance, we're good, kind of thing. Anything to get a document of record, and then by time, because that's the time that they need. They need to get the fraudulent deed, then have time to either market it or have time to refinance it, or whatever the case may be. What we're trying to collapse through Property Watch is the lack of time. Hey, I got a notice that someone just recorded a deed against my house. What am I going to do? Well, 1-800-JEFF-DOLLINGER is where we're going to call and say, hey, we want, you know, Liz Pendens recorded on the public records immediately, okay? So eliminating that time gap. But the owner's title insurance policy should ensure the owner that they are getting clear title to the property. And it should ensure the lender that they have a valid first place mortgage lien. So the problem is, if you don't have that, then you're just out there naked with a deed and you spend a bunch of money, but there's no fallback position to recover from. Okay? So in the instance that I prosecuted, I set aside the deed as a fraudulent conveyance, okay? And then my friend, Jeff Dollinger, over at Scruggs and Carmichael, we stood up and switched chairs, literally, and he said, Your Honor, now that you have set aside the deed, you've ripened the claim for my lender that I'm representing to have a title insurance claim on their policy. So in that particular instance, the lender that relied on the fraudulent deed was made whole. Okay? And at the same time, too, the title insurance company is left out in the cold. Okay? Does that help? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it did, definitely helped with that. However, how much importance do you levy on matching the signatures? Because here, another thing I've heard about the fraudulence is what they do is the signatures from the ID that they have, and they sign on the document at the time of closing, have not often matched, but one doesn't, all title companies do not pick up that detail. How true is that?
So, I mean, I think you can have variations in a signature. I mean, for people that watch, you know, people sign their names 145 times from the time you start to the time you finish, there's some variation. If it's a gross deviation, that may be something, but usually there's something else in the transaction, and I'm looking at y'all going, trust your instincts and call me if you think we've got a problem, because we've unwound several of these, is, you know, where did the license come from? You know, I want to look at some other factors. Now, we can't be profiling, okay? You can't say like, "Oh, Jorge, you don't sound Spanish enough." That's not the right type of thing. But there are other clues along the way that should give you a sixth sense of, something doesn't feel right about this. I've never seen this person. I can only reach them on their schedule, all these various factors that go into it. But I think a really good remedy is this notion of writing to the last known address on the tax bill, because it's oftentimes going to be an out-of-state purported seller, okay? And say, hey, here's my listing agreement that we discussed on the phone on July 17. Here's a copy of the ID that you provided me, and I need you to confirm for me at this telephone number that you are in fact the seller and want to sell this property. Not only do I think that's good practice, I think in the next few years that will actually become law.
It should be. So, Maury, I'm wondering, from the title insurance perspective, we as real estate agents, we get a copy of this and, we can review it, we don't write it. If there's a issue that turns out to be fraudulent somehow or another, can real estate professionals face legal consequences for unintentionally being involved in some sort of fraudulent transaction?
I want to say no, probably not. I mean, if they didn't know, I don't think so, though. I'm not 100% sure on that question. It would probably depend on the details.
Yeah, the devil's going to be in the details, but I agree with Maury. I mean, if Maury gets duped and closes a mortgage loan based on a fraudulent deed and he didn't have any knowledge of that, I don't think there's liability there. Now, if you have any knowledge of that, then you got a major problem. But if you have a title insurance policy, more than likely you're going to be made whole, okay? But if you have a claim of professional negligence, I could see us getting pulled into that net. It's just I don't know that there's ultimately a true liability coming out of the closing attorney's absent, gross negligence.
Yeah, that was the question from one of our members. They were wondering just how liable we as real estate professionals can be. Question in the back?
Hey,
So, two questions. So I've always been told that if the owner of the property does not have the title work, then you don't have title insurance. So like if they don't keep it, nobody else has a copy of it, and so if something were bad to happen.
so someone asked me that question recently, and I don't know the answer yet, Tina, but I'm going to try to figure that out. But when I'm going with people and they're like, oh, they brought the folder from when we closed in 2010, and they're like, what of this can I throw away? I'm like, the title insurance, you keep that forever. That's a permanent record. That's like a life insurance policy, okay? Keep that. But I have a funny feeling that a lot of people, after they sell the house, they're like, oh, I don't need this anymore, and throw it away, okay? But I think your question more specifically is, if Maury writes me a policy and I'm the buyer, and then I lose the policy, am I out of luck? And I think my answer is, I wish this part wasn't recorded, so I'm going to disclaim it now. I think you can probably go to the underwriter and recapture that policy. But I don't want to say that as a statement of fact today, Tina, because I'm unsure of that.
Yeah, I had an issue where it was child support, and it was all, they put a lien on the property, and it didn't come out until like right before closing, and it was a scramble. We were delayed because we had to find his title policy, and he couldn't find it, and we had to delay closing because there was a lien for child support.
Well, I think one of the points to score with y'all in terms of your interface with the customers and clients is if you see somebody and they're like, do we need this title insurance policy from 1995? Yes. Hold on to that. That has value. Or, they leave the closing documents on the table, or they get a letter in the mail that has the title policy and they're like, do I really need this? We're good, right? No. Tell them, yes, you want to hold on to that. That has actual value for you.
My second question is, so we were talking about mortgage fraud, like mortgages, but now it's the cash. So I've had this happen a couple times where you list the land and you think you got it all right, and it's not So if you don't figure, we've always, thank you, Jesus, we've always figured it out to the end of the stop, we didn't lose anybody's money, but had it gone that one extra step, title insurance doesn't help anybody, money's gone, right?
Well, if the buyer in that instance had a title insurance policy ensuring that the buyer is now becoming the rightful owner, yes, the buyer has a title insurance claim.
So the buyer paid his funds for closing, it was officially closed, his title policy would go in effect if his money went to a criminal?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
yes. That's the import of the buyer getting that owner's title insurance policy, okay? Because they now have a claim to say, you, multi-billion-dollar company, ensured that I, John, rightfully purchased and own this property, and now I find out that the deed from the seller was a fraud. It's void from the beginning. Title never passed to me. So at that point in time, the only claim that you have that's really going to result in a recovery is the title insurance policy.
Along the lines of title and purchasing property, and Kelly, since your company works on like a global level, going the other way, because there are lots of Americans and U.S. citizens that are purchasing property in other countries. Have you seen situations where a transfer has been halted because of title issues in a different country?
Not exactly. However, I have seen fraud as it relates to Americans looking to invest overseas. And unfortunately, I heard of 2 scenarios just last week where there's this trend on the horizon, right? We may know friends and family that are doing the same thing, where Americans are looking to purchase real estate in Italy, right? The exchange rate's good. We know that property values, right? Have we seen some cool Instagram posts of people buying these houses and then flipping them? But unfortunately, people are, I hate to say it, but they're kind of like ignoring the common sense pieces of it and thinking that it's all going to be fine, right? And we don't ever want to do that. So I had 2 scenarios last week where customers sent their money to people internationally. There was no paperwork. There was not a contract. There was not anything. But these people contacted what they thought to be an agent in Italy who said, you know, I have this listing. Do you want to buy it? In order to move ahead, you need to just send us 10% and then we can get the ball rolling. And so these people are just going to their banks, sending off 10%, and then wondering why they never heard back from anyone. Twice last week. So just don't be silly. It sounds so elementary, but I think people get caught up in the hype and the excitement, and they don't want to lose out on the opportunity. Because remember, one of the things that fraudsters do is they typically, there's haste. They want to make sure that you hurry up and do this so that you don't have the time to do the steps that you know are right. So just take a deep breath, tell your clients it's okay to slow down. Unfortunately, if you miss out on that property, maybe it wasn't meant to be, right? But it's more important to do your due diligence, have some documentation in place before you're sending money anywhere. So that's an example of some fraud happening currently with Americans looking to buy overseas, not doing some simple steps like having a contract in place or something documented.
And remember, everyone, as members of the National Association of Realtors, we have legitimate resources in all of these countries. So you don't really need to, you don't have to respond to a listing or listing agent that you know nothing about. The NAR has resources, people on the ground that adhere to our same code of ethics. And in order to be a part of the National Association of Realtors family, they agree to this. So these are people that you know that you can rely on to find out whether these listings are real and what the steps are. There was a question earlier.
I had a comment in regards to the property watch. I went through, I was doing due diligence for a buyer who allegedly was selling her property. And the individual that bought the property or was buying the property was really switching title without them knowing and listing it with another company. But what I found out about it, yes, Alachua County will have that property watch. However, this other property that I'm talking about was in Gilchrist County. I tried calling them and they don't follow the same process.
Right.
They don't care. There's other counties outside, so kudos to Alachua, number one on that. But if you're, a lot of these land are not in Alachua for the most part, and those are the ones that are being targeted a lot. Doing due diligence on our side as realtors, some of us, you know, are able to do some of those. When in question, you can always reach out to the Office of the Attorney General. I'm previous investigator for the OAG on white-collar crime like these, and they do have teams that do it. If you want to verify as far as some of the documentation for the Department of Law Enforcement also will assist in those kind of things. But the property watch thing unfortunately doesn't seem to be around north central Florida other than Alachua.
It's not. I think we're only 2 property appraisers in the state. So that's 2 of 67 counties. Now, I think, again, like that trend with the whole letter thing and sending that as a requirement, I think in time, all the property appraisers are going to be required to do that. Those were all like little legislative buds that never really got out of session this last year, but you can kind of see where we're going with some of that stuff. I think it will become the standard, but it's not now. But the main thing also that when I'm selling this at my closing table, I'm going, guys, this isn't an insurance policy. It's just a notice. Okay?
Right.
And property appraisers, clerks of court, all that, they are not allowed to say, you don't look, this doesn't look like you. No, if you present a recordable document, they have an obligation to record it.
Yeah, and remember, that's gonna go via snail mail.
Right.
You may or may not get it, or if you fail to change your address
Sure.
as the owner of the property, that also becomes an issue.
But Kelly scores this huge point that I also want to reiterate again. It's time.
Time.
The closest we came to actually having an incident started at 4:40 on a Friday afternoon. And by 4:50, we had unwound it and solved the problem in 10 minutes. But in that 10 minutes was a pressure crush of action and a flurry of calls. You know, all of these things, if you don't know, I don't know how much you guys are really involved in this, but you know, everyone at my office has the chief of security for our bank on speed dial, okay? Love to believe the FBI would help more. I got an office in Miami. I'm still waiting on a call back about a year later. But, you know, so the time pressure thing, if you are feeling the time pressure and not feeling right about something, just hit the pause button and get right before you make something in haste that's a bad decision.
And if we do, question in the back.
I just stepped out for a second. I apologize. I just got a call to kind of fit in for this. And it's probably more of Martin Kelly. So my call was just a buyer from abroad. They're from a country that does not tend to be very friendly when it comes to transferring funds to the U.S. They wanted to write an offer on a unit that I have. They haven't seen it. It looks like a good investment for them. They're not in a rush. You know, they can do it in 30, 45 days. I asked them, you know, I need a proof of funds from whatever that account that is. It does need to be in the States for 90 days before you can close preferably. And you know, I need some sort of proof of ID. You know, can you email that to me? Well, you know, I don't really want to email anything. You know, can I send it to you? Well, how are you going to send it to me? Can I send it FedEx or UPS? So whenever it comes to transferring those funds, how do you verify those funds to make sure that they come from the source that they need to come from to be legal to purchase property in the U.S.? And from the title perspective, how would you verify that buyer coming from abroad to be able to purchase this property?
That's for
I'll start, okay. So in order to utilize Money Corp, there is a due diligence process. We obviously need to take this customer through KYC, so it would involve us making a phone call to the customer to introduce our services to make sure that we're a good fit for what they're looking to do, right? We need to find out, are their funds held in a foreign currency or are their funds held in US dollars in a foreign account? Because if the funds are already in US dollars and then it just becomes an international transfer but not a foreign currency and international transfer, then I'm not involved. And there's nothing stopping them at that point from just doing a bank-to-bank international transfer, right? No FX, just US dollars to US dollars. So that part I wouldn't be involved with. But let's start asking the questions. What currency are your funds in, right? And if they tell you, I live in Nigeria, my funds are in euros, I'm buying a property in America, they're just complicating this even more, right? If they say they're in France and their funds are in euros, well, that makes sense. But if they start saying, my funds are in Isle of Man, I live here, then we need to just, again, start doing the due diligence. Don't underestimate the power of Google, right? If someone tells you they're the Prince of Saudi Arabia, Google it. If someone tells you they're the CEO of a specific organization, Google it. Most of the times on websites, there's an About Us tab. You'll click, you'll see the entire C-suite of employees. And then start asking questions. If it doesn't feel right, obviously ask even more questions. But those are some of the no-brainer things. Take the time, Google somebody's name. You might find out something that doesn't exactly match. But I would suggest responding to that client and saying, great news, we work with a preferred foreign currency exchange company. I've copied Kelly in on this email at Money Corp. She'd be happy to reach out to you to explain how they might be able to assist you with facilitating your currency exchange and international transfer needs. Let's go ahead and get that process started while I start, looking for properties for you. And that'll give me the ability to do all the different KYC checks and come back to you hopefully with a response saying, things look good from our perspective, or actually, I wouldn't proceed with this customer. In many instances, I'm not actually able to tell you why we can't help with that client, but if I tell you that we can't help with that customer, it's probably a good idea to disengage, right? I might tell you that we can't help, but I'll give you a specific reason, right? In some instances, we might not be able to help with the specific currency, right? I can do most major currencies, but there's some currencies out there that actually I can't help. But I'd be specific in telling you we can't help with the individual or we can't help with the currency. And if I tell you we can't help with the individual, then that's something that you might want to slow down on or, not proceed with the transaction. But I would suggest anytime a foreign national, get Money Corp involved as early on as possible so that we can help you vet that client.
And what was the second part of the question?
And then how would you vet the buyer to ensure that they are who they say that they are? Thankfully, in this situation, they have an LLC that they've established in Florida because they purchased property prior. But if that weren't the situation, what would be that process to make sure that somebody's actually purchasing this and not trying to pull like a they can't run scenario?
So I think that question's more for you, but just real quick, in order to set up an account with Money Corp, we use different programs, things like Experian, LexisNexis, that help us prove someone's identity. But secondly, we would require documentation, which would be things like photo ID, passport, a utility bill, bank statement. If that didn't suffice, if they're in what's known as maybe a medium or high-risk jurisdiction, we would ask for things further, such as proof of source of funds, right? You'd then have to provide additional documentation. But over to you as far as how you would vet the buyer further than that.
Well, first of all, I like this problem because typically a buyer with money can't really do us any harm other than waste our, or if your buyer's not real, the worst that's gonna happen is he's gonna waste all of our time. It's a lot better than the reverse where I'm dealing with a seller who I'm sending money to who can actually steal that money. Buyers can't steal real property. It's attached to the land, or it is the land, so that's good. But time is valuable, and you get calls all the time, and you don't want to spend a lot of time working with somebody who's either just wasting your time or is going to pull another fraud that sometimes happens where they try to send money as a deposit or extra money, and then, but it's non-cleared funds, and then before those funds clear, they request it back in your own cleared funds. So there is a little fraud there, but the way I would treat this one is, it's kind of odd that they don't want to email anything. There's secure ways to email it. Would you be okay if we sent you a secure portal link and you could transfer it to us like that? Would you take a picture of something and send it to me? If this person was really willing to UPS me some documents, I'd say, okay, send them on over. And I probably wouldn't put too much time into it until I got those documents, but that's an okay way to send if he actually sends documents and I get them and they start looking really good. Man, maybe this is just an old school buyer who's actually not wasting my time. And the other way is involve other professionals. Fraudsters don't like professionals. You know, the minute you start talking about, you know, you need a document notarized, or you want to involve MoneyCorp, or I'm going to send you a link to my attorney's secure email portal, they're going to go look for someone else who they can take advantage of, who's not going to try to do all these things. So I think a lot of times just pushing back a little bit has scared the fraudsters away. They don't like this type of stuff. One trick that I've kind of recently learned is, if you're worried about somebody because of just little red flags like this, tell them you have a document that you need signed, and we'll do it through remote online notarization, which is good for a couple reasons. One, it's videotaped, and two, they can generate knowledge-based questions, authentication questions, as long as they have had at least some presence in the U.S., and I'm not sure if they could generate them based off public record information in other countries. So this may or may not work for international, but anyway, that will probably scare a fraudster off immediately, because they know, I don't want to be videotaped. I got to hold my ID up. That ID gets sent through a verification program, and I have to answer knowledge-based authentication questions. So that's a good way that we've used when a realtor had a seller who was out of the country, owned property here. The red flags were going up. But this seller did that, signed a listing agreement like that. So it turns out it was okay. You know, kind of suspicious, but it was okay. No fraudster would have done that. So that's how you can sort of weed things out from the get-go, just so they don't waste everybody's time at best, and then in certain cases save money at worst.
Looks like taking time. Yeah, you go ahead, and then we'll get to your question.
So I want to tack on with what Maury said, because I like that. I just adopted a new strategy. Thanks, brother. But what you will see from us when you have a buyer that is a mail away to the buyer is we are likely to say, that's fine, but we're going to pick the mobile notary, because there are insured mobile notaries. Or alternatively, that's fine, but they have to go to my friend Maury's office to witness, because I know that Maury's going to do a good job. What I don't want is just the wild, wild west of, oh, tell us where to email you a package, and then you send it back, and we have no knowledge about who the notary is, which would be in on the fraud, by the way, or no knowledge about the quality of the services being rendered. Those types of things, that also is going to thwart it. Now, there's plenty of times that there's legitimate things where they're like, well, I have my own, regular attorney in St. Louis. I'm like, good, have him call me. And then I've got the bar up, and, I can look at their website, and Danny calls and says, hey, Danny, it's like, hey, by the way, I just want you to know I'm a real person. I have a long-standing relationship with these clients. They're legit. They're just looking to relocate to take advantage of employment at the University of Florida. Okay, well, that just solved a whole bunch of problems now, didn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Your questions, please.
Kelly, I was wondering, what is your fee structure, and who pays it, and how do you work?
Sure. So there is no cost or obligation to establish an account with MoneyCorp. That's why I'd love to go through that process for your potential buyer. That way we can get through that step initially. There's additionally no fees to utilize MoneyCorp. So your client will not be charged anything. And now you're sitting there going, well, how does MoneyCorp make their money? So I'll answer that question. So I'm gonna bore you for a second, but I think it will turn on some light bulbs. There's something known as the interbank rate of exchange. If you ever Google what an exchange rate is, or you look on Bloomberg, that rate of exchange that you're seeing online is the rate of exchange that big banks are buying and selling millions of dollars of currency at any moment in time. That's not the rate that you or I or your customers are ever gonna have access to. Because of the volume of foreign transactions that Moneycorp is involved with, we get that rate of exchange, right? We have a relationship directly with the Federal Reserve. We buy money at the actual interbank rate of exchange. So did the client's banks. When the client goes to the bank, however, and they go to facilitate a transaction, one, the bank is going to charge them an international transfer fee. Typically, international wire fees range from $20 to $75. That's really small in the grand scheme of things, but that's a transparent fee that your client will be told. What the client will not be told is the rate of exchange that the bank is offering to them is probably about 3, 5, 8, or sometimes even 10% off of what the true exchange rate is. So when a client starts doing transactions from their bank and they're going, okay, here's my $50, the reality is the bank is probably making $5, $10, potentially $20,000 more on the actual client's currency exchange of their money itself. Moneycorp makes our money exactly the same way, so total transparency there. However, we choose to make less. So Moneycorp's typical margin is less than 1%. So when you're dealing with a cash buyer that's looking to transfer $150,000 or more, we're gonna get them really, really close to that actual exchange rate, which is gonna save the client a tremendous amount of money. We're not gonna charge them an international transfer fee, and Moneycorp is gonna make a profit on that margin. But again, bank is making 5% margin, Moneycorp's making 0.5% margin, so significantly smaller margins, but we do enormous volumes in foreign currency exchange. Last year we did $90 billion, right? At a 0.5% margin, we're doing okay. And your clients don't have to pay the fees. We don't deal. Do we deal in Bitcoin? We work in the cryptocurrency space, but with the actual providers, not with the actual consumers, right? So when these big companies need to cash out in foreign currencies, we work with them, but we don't work with specific private clients that say, I want to buy $10,000 worth of Bitcoin. So not from a private client perspective, but from a corporate perspective, we can.
Great, so they can save your customer money and help catch the fraud. Gentleman over there had a question.
To the attorneys, in the economy we're in right now, contract flipping has become pretty prevalent. We are not ever dealing with the seller, the true owner of the property. And so how do you recommend us deal with title issues potential when we don't have the capability of asking the seller to provide us with title insurance?
Mark, do you mean like some of the ones we've seen where, what is it, yeah, kind of that notion of like, hey, I'm gonna buy your property from you for $50,000, I'll close sometime in the next 180 days. And then I now have the contract and now I'm trying to go to get Kelly to buy it for $100,000.
Yes. So again, that person that's coming to us, call it your wholesaler or whatever, they don't own the property, they don't have a clear title, they can't even convey, and we never get a chance to talk to that seller. If I'm not mistaken, wouldn't we be concerned about tortious intervention by going to the seller and messing up their deal?
Why don't you let us do that? You know what I mean?
That's why I'm asking the question.
Because,
How do we handle that?
I mean, to me, you know I don't like those flips anyway, because someone is already usually in dire straits, and now you got, your foot on their back too. So
I don't like them either, we don't get to deal with the seller.
right, but I'm going to try to get behind that because I've got a legitimate business reason in talking to the seller to say, hey, listen, you've got someone here that is purporting to buy your property. You signed either this wholesaling listing agreement or they have a contract to buy your property for X amount of dollars that's assignable to another third party. I need to start coordinating with you to deal with how, are you married or not, you know, all those legitimate, like Florida constitutional homestead stuff. I want to go end around to speak directly with the seller to try to figure out where they are in the process. I've never had one of those go through successfully, Mark.
Well, we have, but now we're starting to see these wholesalers are not local. They're international. And it's throwing even more of a risk.
More, do you do anything different?
Well, you said no title insurance.
Well, again, we're not talking to the seller. We're talking to this person who's.
Yeah, but that original contract should say that seller is gonna issue a title insurance policy or buyer is gonna pay for one, right?
Not on some. Some of them, the wholesalers are using their contract, which is extremely sided one way.
Yeah.
And they won't provide us with the information regarding who the actual owner of the property is. Why? They don't want us to go to them and say, why in the world are you selling to this guy at this price? So we're now dealing separately with, typically, we're dealing with a buyer. And the buyer wants to be that person that gets this property so he can do something else with it. But that middle person that's out there, he's got nothing. And he's just flipping his paper for something.
Yeah, no, I definitely get it. If this is a transaction without title insurance, I'd take my buyer somewhere else because there's so many other things that may come up. If it's a transaction with title insurance, I agree with John. It really doesn't matter. You got a seller and a buyer, and we need to do a closing. Take it to the closing company. We're gonna pick up the phone and call the seller. And if the seller wants to avoid that, well, how are you gonna sell your property if you don't deal with a closing agent?
Well, I think what my question is ultimately, I agree. We're telling our buyers, be represented locally. That way you won't have anything, pay for the title insurance yourself, so it's all covered. But what I'm trying to do is lessen to get that far down the road. Can we go to you ahead of time?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely, yeah.
Amber, I'll get you next. Heather, you had a question?
Well, my question has always been on this wholesaling, and I do flip to rehab, so, you know, but wholesaling is selling the paper, it's not selling the property. You're selling the document. So how do we legally sell document? Aren't we only supposed to sell real property? Because even though it may be attached, on a wholesaler, they're selling their contract. They're not selling the house because they don't own the house yet. So how can we actually facilitate on a wholesaler?
Excellent question.
I don't, it's okay. I don't want to sound dismissive. I just would try to stay away from that entire paradigm.
Oh, no, that's why I don't do it. I don't
Yeah.
even wholesale on my personal level because of those issues, but we do have people that are selling paper and people are buying paper, but it's not actual real property, so I don't know how legally we can do that.
So-
With our real estate license.
So, not addressing the licensure component, but I think it's a very legitimate question, okay? The ones that bother me are usually about 3/4 of a page. You know, there's no allocation of costs particularly, and it's a rock bottom price. And then you get someone that's usually an investor that says, gosh, even if I pay $20,000 more than this rock bottom price, I can still do something with this, okay? So that's the person that I'm always trying to pull back and go, you know, I don't know that you really want to get engaged with this.
Oh, no, I advise typically against it.
Yeah.
I don't really like to do it. I just always, since we have this here, wondered how.
But I think it's different if you have, you know, like the FAR bar, okay, and someone is legitimately going to assign the FAR bar to a third party. I haven't seen a whole lot of that lately, but I do remember it going back to the last big run-up where someone would be like, hey, I really want that particular house. I'll pay you $15,000 for your FAR bar contract. I think that's a little bit different than some of the wholesalers that we've seen. And I think there's ways to do that legitimately where you have, you know, for example, an assignment fee shown on the closing statement. I don't want to hide that ball. Just show it on the closing statement. You know, assignment fee. John's paying Heather $10,000 for that contract for that cherry property in Hale Plantation. You know, we have had a couple of instances like that. I'm still not a big fan of them, but they've happened.
So it sounds like we've got this resource to help avoid paper fraud, deed fraud, to use our resources, the folks in our town too. I'll come to you next. Amber had a question.
Marquia?
I'm sorry, Marquis.
I just want to make sure it wasn't the Amber
Excuse
behind me. So John and Mara, you guys have both said, let you guys handle that. If we've got the buyer, we're typically not picking the closing agent. So do I just recommend my customer to you for real estate attorney advice, since you're not actually handling the closing?
Yeah, you certainly could do that, and we could try to help parse things out there. Yeah, I think in that situation, you know, you have your buyer, this buyer's take an assignment of the contract, and the attorney could look at the whole deal, look at the original contract, because again, when you're purchasing a contract, and it's always kind of funny, because typically no money actually changes until the closing happens. So you're just stepping into the contract, but then the seller or the original buyer doesn't really want to show the contract because they're afraid you're going to figure out how much that person's making. But you know, hey, if you're going to sign me a contract, I got to see the contract. So you could start there. But yeah, absolutely. If that would be a good first step, to just start looking at everything and see if it's something that's legitimate and can actually be done correctly.
Thank you.
I'm going to answer it a little bit differently. I wanted to defer to Maury first, especially if he is interested in buyer rep. I'm probably not interested as doing pure buyer rep when there's a question mark about the viability of the overall transaction, okay? And that may be just the way that I'm built and that we've been busy for 3 years, and you know, buyer reps have been hard to be effective in, okay? But I think I've got a lot more latitude as the closing attorney because I now have a completely legitimate interest in finding out all about that seller, getting their mortgage payoff. You know, oftentimes you'll see these wholesale properties are in distress, so there's a foreclosure action involved, and there's tax problems, the whole package deal. It's out there. It's just a big old soup pot full of problems, okay? So my answer is just slightly different than that insofar as I'm probably not going to be interested in the buyer rep part.
But if I could get them to pay for.
If somebody's paying for the title insurance, I got to go all in, right? You know, I mean, I've got to go 100% in. I've got to get a title insurance commitment. I've got to look at the liens that are attached to the property, whether that is, you know, IRS problems, foreclosure problems, mortgage in default, whatever the case may be. If I'm being called upon to insure that title, I got to go all the way in. So that becomes more of a engagement level.
If I may just add one little thing. So I think it's important for agents to have two toolkits, right? Maybe a toolkit that you dive into for like a cookie cutter transaction, and then you're gonna want a separate toolbox for anything to do with an international transaction, right? And that might be an immigration attorney, an international tax consultant, a foreign national lender. And if I'm rattling these things off and you go, ooh, I don't know an international tax consultant or someone that specializes in FIRPTA and all these weird and wonderful things, then by all means feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to give you a list of those resources. But I would say one thing that I've seen happen before is when you're working with a foreign national client and you may be working with a title company that you've worked with in the past on these cookie cutter transactions but never on anything international, you might want to ask them, have you done international transactions before? Because what I see happen sometimes is title companies that are fantastic at something normal, and then you just do kind of a simple international transaction and they kind of muck it up pretty bad. So I would say, even if you're not representing the seller and you don't get to potentially choose the title company that you're using, it's okay to maybe reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, you know, not for nothing, but can you just confirm that the title company involved in this transaction has dealt with a foreign national closing before? Because I just want to make sure that we're going through the right protocol. And they might go, actually, they've never done a foreign national transaction before, and maybe they'll put their hands up and say, we're not the best company to deal with this. So I've just seen those types of things happen before, and they can go sideways quickly, so just make sure that you're working with resources in that international toolkit that can help you get the transaction done. These guys can probably help with that.
All right, we've got another question.
Talking of foreign nationals, how effective is the bill of preempt ban on foreign citizens from investing in the U.S. in properties
Yeah.
for Florida? Because I know some of the states have already kind of signed it, and I understand Florida is due to or has already.
It's in effect.
It's in effect.
It's- Yes, that bill was signed July 1 of this year and is in effect. And the shifting sands and the rising tide of how to deal with that changes almost on a daily, if not hourly basis.
John, when you were talking about the fact of not representing a buyer and so, but I always say to my buyers, I said, you're taking on liability. And that selling agent with the title insurance is not looking after you particularly. I think you should have a buyer rep or an attorney to represent you, and you do it for me all the time. And so at that point in time, I assume you're checking into the title insurance that was provided, and you're looking at the survey and you're representing it.
That's correct. If I'm engaged as a buyer rep and accept that engagement, then I'm looking at the deed, I'm looking at the title insurance commitment, I'm looking at the survey. If you have any specific concerns that you're expressing, okay, then I'm going to do that when I undertake that as a genuine buyer representation, okay?
And usually later on, you get their wills, you get everything else, because they just come in from out of state, they don't know anybody, and that's how I.
Giving away my business model, Lorraine.
I would prefer an attorney to represent my buyers.
Sure.
Again, they're taking on the
Right.
liability.
But I think it's important for this group to know too, customarily, when you send over a seller file, I'm undertaking that as seller representation.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to go over the survey with the buyer or provide them the title insurance commitment or otherwise provide services that look pretty lawyery, but they're really on behalf of the seller. There's like a collateral
You
benefit.
even sign an affidavit stating that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk amongst the Florida bar that says, in the ideal world of the Florida bar, we'd have Maury's representing the seller, I'm representing the buyer, Kelly's there on behalf of the lender, and then we can add some more lawyers around to where it becomes so uncost effective. But, those kinds of situations can get rather sticky.
All right, any other questions? Well, I'd like to end with one question. It was on my list, kind of got pushed to the bottom, but when Kelly mentioned FERPTA, it popped back up on the list. And FERPTA in relation to the new law that came out July 1st. So the new law that came out July 1st with the shift in sands, which is true, kind of focuses on buyers. FERPTA focuses on, well, I would say buyers and sellers, who's gonna pay those taxes? I think that's one of the parts of the contract that oftentimes we kind of like overlook, because we don't have to deal with it. Can you all talk a little bit about FERPTA and how we may see more of sellers from some of these countries that are, the sands are shifting and there are buyers and sellers that are going to be affected. Can you talk a little bit about that? This is sort of our last question as we wrap it up.
Y'all want me to take that one for a warm-up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can jump in
So
after.
FERPTA on the seller side is usually driven largely by price. So then if we see, okay, we've got a foreign seller above this price point, then I'm going to, as Kelly suggested, my CPA that advises on that, and I say, okay, here's my facts. Do I need to withhold a percentage of the sales proceeds in my trust account? And then hopefully that CPA also gets engaged with that seller So that what I'm trying to do is, you guys, as the CPA professional, the seller, you tell me where to send the money and for how much, okay? But other than that, I don't really want to be too much in that decision tree without the support of someone that really knows what's going on.
All right, so correct me if I'm wrong, but FIRPTA is the Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act.
A plus.
Right, I'm done. All right, so as a foreign national seller, the title company is likely going to advise the seller that they're going to withhold a percentage of the sales price so that in the event there's taxes due at the end of the year, there's enough to cover it, right? Because what the IRS doesn't want to do is run the risk of this seller taking all their money back to their home country and then sending them a bill at the end of the year, because then if the seller decides, I'm not paying that, but I'm never going back to the US, so I don't really care about my, history with the US or my reputation, then it's difficult for the IRS to kind of chase down those back taxes that are due. So the title company holds on to those funds. There's two things that come to my mind here to consider. Sometimes the title company actually holds the funds and they don't then send the funds off to the IRS, which actually is good, because when the IRS submits this letter that says, okay, foreign national seller, you're free and clear, we actually don't need those funds, then the title company can just send the US dollars to Money Corp, we convert them to euros, we send them back home to the seller, happy days. In the event the title company doesn't hold the funds and actually they send them to the IRS, then it becomes a bit more challenging, because the IRS says that they're only going to do one of two things with those funds if they in fact are due back to the seller. One, they're either going to do a domestic wire transfer into a US dollar bank account in the US, but your foreign national seller might not have a bank account, so that might not be an option. Or two, they're going to mail the seller a check. If you live overseas and you receive a check for 10,000 US dollars, what are you supposed to do with that check? You don't have an American bank account. So if the IRS in fact receives those funds and then at a later date releases the FIRPTA withholding, you've got some hurdles to jump through. Reach out to me. There's all kinds of different scenarios that we can get through, but neither of the options are great. You don't want them to put their funds in an American bank account, because one, they might not have one, or two, the funds are then stuck there because the United States Patriot Act states that you have to be physically present in order to do an international transfer. So if you're dealing with a foreign national seller, just please reach out to me. We'll go through all of these different scenarios so that your client can actually get their money that's rightfully theirs and due back to them, back to their home country once they are free and clear of their tax obligations here in the US. I've been on probably over 1,000 presentations with attorneys and people that really specialize in FIRPTA that are not related to the currency exchange part of it, so I'm happy to really give you some hands-on experience when it comes to that.
All righty, well, if we don't have any other questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you all so much for participating.